So the first piece is reading the question, and this is my top tip to you. I would suggest this is the top tip from the entire presentation, so you didn't have to wait long for it, is answer the question that's been asked. Okay, so this is a really important thing to remember. It may seem like common sense, but it's easy to forget these things when you're doing the exam. So just bear this in mind as you go through your mock papers. I need to make sure that my answer is in alignment with the question. It's always coming back from the examiner, this kind of issue that students have sometimes where they misinterpret the question, they misinterpret what's actually being examined. It's really important that your answer is in alignment with the question. So how do we overcome this, or what are some top tips in regards to this theme of answering the question? Well, you need to make sure that you're reading through the question very carefully. And when I say question, I mean the subtask. So that's the small piece that has the percentage written beside it. If you've ever done the exam before, maybe you have, or maybe you've seen the exam papers. Don't stress if you haven't, because we will be looking at a sample question in the next slide. So if that doesn't make sense to you, don't worry at this stage. But basically, you're given a series of questions, and you need to make sure that you're reading through those very, very, very carefully, okay? And we'll see why in a few minutes. Now, you also need to make sure that you understand the requirements. So make sure you know what it is that CIMA are actually looking for. And what I mean by that is sometimes in the exam papers, you'll get a question and it will have the word "and" in it. So, give, for example, the currency risks associated with this decision and how you would hedge against those risks. Now, in that regard, there's two questions in one. And I could guarantee you the marking scheme would be split in half between those two different requirements. But many students would just look at the first piece, they talk about currency risk, and they just skip the next piece. So it's really important that you make sure you read through the question very carefully. Now, you also need to make sure that your answer is in alignment with what's being asked. I mentioned that already. But what I'm talking about here is that sometimes there's a tendency for students to start writing something, and then over time, that narrative drifts away from the actual question that's being asked. So they start off, their answer starts off really good. And then over time, it kind of slips away from what's being asked. And actually the student starts talking about things like current affairs, or they start talking about material that they're comfortable with, or they start talking about irrelevant material. This is really, really common. So you need to make sure that you're constantly focused on your answer. You're answering the question that's been asked all the way through your answer. Okay, so it's all great me talking about this, but what does this look like in reality? Okay, so this is an example. So say, for example, you go into your paper, okay, and you're thinking of setting it in November, and you get this question. So it says, following a legislative change, the firm's share price immediately dropped by 10%, but over the course of the day, it increased up by 7%. Discuss if there is a rational economic explanation for these price movements. Subtask A, 50%. And this actually came from the SCS prototype exam, variant 1, section 1, which was a paper that CIMA put together for students so that they could understand what the paper would look like back in 2019. Okay, so how would you interpret this question? It's a tricky question, isn't it? And I'm conscious that some of you may not have, gone through F3 in detail. Yes, okay, it's early days, but how would you have approached this question? Think about it. So it says, following a legislative change, the firm's share price immediately dropped by 10%. So that's one movement. Over the course of the day, it increased back up by 7%. That's one movement. And the last movement really is the fact that it's 3% lower than it was at the start of the day. The question is saying, discuss if there is a rational economic explanation for these price movements. So the correct interpretation will talk about a rationalization for those price movements at different stages. Okay, so for example, and we're not going to get too technical, okay, because I'm conscious this is an exam technique webinar, it's not an F3 webinar, but it is important to know the answer, of course. If something similar comes up, hopefully you'll be well prepared in your exam. Say, for example, there is strong, it's a strongly efficient market in this scenario. Okay, so this is touching on efficient market hypothesis. That's what that EMH stands for. And what this means basically is that all publicly available information and as well private information is built into the share price of a company. So if that's the case in this scenario, well, possibly the risk of the legislation changing was worse than shareholders or investors or traders would have anticipated. They knew it was going to happen, and that was built into the share price. but it was worse than they expected, or the timing was different. Okay, so that could have been the case. Maybe that's why there was this drop in the share price. Now, you could also have a semi-strong, efficient market. So in that case, only publicly available information is built into the share price. So this release of new adverse information, bad information for the business, it's bad news for the business, essentially. That's been released now, and everyone's aware of that, and they are taking that into consideration in their shareholding. So maybe they're thinking, okay, this legislative change is not good for the business. I'm selling my shares. And as a result, then the price goes down. Now, as well, you could have a situation where the share price has dropped. Okay, so we've covered that piece. Now, what about the rally? Okay, so it said during the course of the day, it increased back up by 7%. But what could have happened is that you could have had investors, shareholders, traders, they could have been assessing the information, and they actually possibly came to the judgment that after thinking about it for a while, because markets are not instantaneous, sometimes shareholders, investors, they have to think about these things. They've assessed the situation, and maybe they've come to a conclusion that the legislative change is actually not as bad as perhaps initially expected. So they've taken into consideration the information, they've done an analysis, and they've basically concluded that the information is not as bad as initially expected. So the price went back up then as people started buying the shares. Now, of course, you could have speculatory forces. You could be talking about that as well. So possibly you had traders, institutional traders, maybe, high frequency trading as well, getting in on the volatility. So that's where traders make money. In volatility. Volatility is just price changes. Okay, so that's where people make money. So if the share price went down, could have had short sellers trying to make money off that. And then when the share price was lower, so it says there it dropped by 10%, possibly an evaluation of that share price actually revealed that it was underpriced, and so the traders then purchased that at that kind of lower level, and then all that buying back up then brought the share price back up. Okay, so these are all rational economic explanations. And the last one then is the fact that the share price at the moment is 3% lower than it was at the beginning of the day. And maybe that reflects the true value of that share. With all of the information taken into consideration, the legislative change is negative for the business. It's going to affect the business. So a 3% drop is the actual economic damage, I suppose, that has occurred to the share price as a result of this change in legislation. Okay. Now, what's the incorrect interpretation? This is a little bit more interesting, I think. Okay, so we've done the correct way of interpreting this question. What sort of answers would have been given by students who incorrectly interpreted this question? Well, I can tell you for sure there would be answers about the implications of share price decreasing, why a falling share price is bad, the actions the organization should now take, how Brexit and COVID are affecting markets. And I do fully appreciate, guys, it's really easy to talk about these things. I know COVID's affecting a lot of us in a big way. And I know as well, Brexit, especially if you're based in the UK, it's tempting to talk about it, but it's not being examined here. We can't say, well, it dropped by 10% because of Brexit. That's not the case in this particular instance. Okay, so, those are kind of answers that they're not in alignment with what's being asked. And the last one there is important, generic reasons. So what does generic mean? Just means general. It just could be applied to any pre-scene, any scenario at all. That's not what the markets want to see. They want to see an applied answer, an answer that's specific to that scenario. Okay. So correct interpretation, incorrect interpretation. You can see the incorrect interpretation is just missing the point of the question. Okay, so we always have some tips after each of these sections. So these are my tips in regards to reading the question. Make sure you read through the questions several times. A lot of them are very small. It doesn't take much time to read through them. Just make sure you go through them a few times, okay? You have 60 minutes per section, so you have a good bit of time. So just make sure you read through those subtasks just very carefully, okay? Watch the wording being used. Make a note of the requirement inside your answer box as a reminder. Okay, this was a tip that I used myself when I was doing the SES paper. And what I'm saying here is sometimes we can forget what it is that we're actually answering. Okay, that's happened to me before, especially, if you're writing for half an hour, you may kind of forget what it is that you're actually answering. So one way of overcoming that is to just put a little bit of a note inside your answer box. So for example, currency risk and hedging tools. So that way, okay, I have to talk about currency risk, and I also have to talk about hedging tools. Okay, so again, small things just to prompt you into staying in alignment with what's being asked. Now, have a look through the exam papers and the suggested solutions. I recommend having a look at them from 2020 onwards, okay, because it was a syllabus change, but there's no harm looking at old ones. Just be conscious there may be some off-syllabus content in them. And what you're really aiming to do here is you're aiming to see, okay, how have CIMA asked questions in the past and how do they interpret their own questions? So that if you get something similar on the day of the exam, you'll know how to interpret it because you know how CIMA have done it in the past themselves, okay? So yeah, it's a really, really effective strategy.